Hello everyone, I'm Matt Britton. I'm the Director General of the BBC, and I'm in this job at a really important time as we seek to negotiate a new charter with government, a charter that can help us to meet the moment in terms of the disruption of the media industry, the battle for truth, and it's really important that we reinvent the BBC for today and tomorrow. Really grateful to everyone who sent in their questions and suggestions and supported us in making this change together. And so I'm going to answer some of those questions now to the best of my ability at random. What's your plan for the future of the World Service? It's a unique service of value to UK listeners, but has a vital role to play across many countries, not to mention its importance for the UK's soft power. Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a real jewel in the crown, not of the BBC, but actually for the country. The BBC is the number one most trusted provider of news. World Service BBC content reaches over 500 million people every week. That's an enormous reach. 45 different languages, and 75% of that reach is to people in countries which have very limited media freedom. So you can see what a vital service it is today. It's got the potential to grow much bigger. We also know that people who consume World Service content are more likely to want to come to the UK for education or tourism or trade. So it's got an economic impact as well as a sort of what people could talk about soft power alignment with British values. What I'd like to see is the government taking back full funding responsibility for the World Service. There's hardly an investment that they could make that's better for the reputation and democratic power of the UK internationally, and that's what we'll be arguing for. What's your favourite programme on the Beeb? Says somebody. Now, this is a tricky one. It's a bit like asking a parent, what's your favourite child? I love the output, and since arriving, one of the things I've discovered actually is BBC Radio 3. I hadn't really listened to classical music other than in passing, and I found it really calming. We also put on the Proms, which is the world's biggest and longest running classical music festival. And I was astonished to find that last year, more than 11 million people were in contact with Proms content across the BBC. 40% of the audience under 40. So it's something where we're bringing something to new people and introducing something. So I love that part of the BBC's mission. I could go on across the content in news and local radio and so on, but I think what I would turn to is the impression the BBC made on me before I joined. And I love shows that bring people together. I love watching Traitors and Strictly with my family. I grew up as a fan of Doctor Who, and I loved it when Doctor Who regenerated after a period and came back, and I was able to sit with my two sons either side me and watch Christopher Eccleston lead a new era of Doctor Who. So I'm also excited about where the Doctor regenerates again and comes back from the time vortex to entertain us in future. And here's another question. What are your thoughts on the current licence fee arrangements? Is there an alternative while keeping the BBC's independence and keeping it free of advertising? Well, I definitely think that the current licence fee is hard to sustain. It's a model that was built on the way people consumed yesterday, and we know that something like 94% of adults consume the BBC every month, but only 80% of households are paying, so that is stretching too far to be sustainable. So what are the alternatives? And we've looked at an array of them, and lots have been proposed to government. Whatever mechanism we end up with, it needs to be something that's universal, that gives us sufficient funding to fulfill our mission, and that is simple to understand. And some people have said we should take advertising. And my concern as somebody who's worked for years in advertising business organisations is that if we were to do that, we would take advertising away from others in the TV market. And TV advertising is shrinking at the moment, so there'd be two things that happen. One, other players like Channel 4, ITV with public service remits would have less. And secondly, it would fundamentally change the nature of what the BBC's incentivized to do, because we'd be, like them, having to look at audience reach above some of the public service values, and I think that would be a real challenge. So I think a BBC that's publicly funded without advertising or subscription allows us to fulfill that mission as part of a rich ecosystem of other players who also have some public service remit. So that's the conversation at the heart of the Charter renewal for us. Here's a question. What's your vision for how the BBC should look in 2036? Well, that's a big question, isn't it? I'm working on that with our team, and I think one of the challenges we face is the pace of change in the world today. Audiences are shifting their behavior at all age categories now, all around the world, and we see the consolidation and change in the media industry at large happening all around us. So what we need to do is take the BBC's core values, informing, educating, entertaining audiences, and reinvent how we do that in today's world. I'm sitting here in Broadcasting House, where it all started a century ago for the BBC, and what I try to do is tap into the pioneering spirit of the people who invented broadcast radio and its content. They invented broadcast television and its content. They invented iPlayer ahead of Netflix launching here in the UK. We've got to innovate again. And so what we're looking to do is try to ensure that we go closer to audiences, both where they're watching and how they're watching and consuming, but also the stories that really matter to people in their lives today. We can learn much more about our audiences than the pioneers could, because we get feedback all the time. We need to be a simpler BBC. It's very easy to get complicated with all these different services. And we need to be simpler because we have to be faster to the future. We need to operate with velocity to keep pace with the changes that are happening, whether it's AI, misinformation, or changes in how we all consume. So that's what we're doing to try and reinvent the BBC for today's world and tomorrow's world, but with our values at the heart of our mission. How difficult is it to speak truth to power, or even to keep on speaking the truth in the midst of so much misinformation and disinformation? Well, that question really is at the heart of our mission to inform and what we do at BBC News. We are still the world's most trusted international provider of news. We're relied on by over 500 million people every week to inform them about what's going on in the world. And you're right to say, this is a world of misinformation. When I grew up, it was only really the BBC that could talk to a global audience, and that was because we had transmitters in the Ascension Islands and all this infrastructure. And today, any one of the 6 billion people with a smartphone can produce content at Hollywood quality and distribute it all around the world. What a change in that world it is. And therefore, we need trusted information more than ever. And that's why I'm working with my colleagues at BBC News to ensure that our stories are where the audience are, that we work really hard through services like BBC Verify to ensure that we understand the truth behind the stories and fight in this battle for truth that we're all seeing. So it's really important that we have high standards in our journalism. We cover the stories that matter to people, and we tell those stories in the places where people go for their information. What is the BBC's strategy for capturing and retaining enough of the attention and interest of younger generations so as to ensure the BBC's future? This question, perhaps it's the top question that I worry about every day, because I think we need to serve all audiences, and we know that younger audiences have very different habits in their media consumption and the information and the entertainment that they enjoy every day. And so we've got work to do. But I think if you wanted to start from somewhere with younger audiences, you could start from a worse place than we're in. So firstly, among 16 to 34s, I think about 70% of them come to the BBC every month. If you think about the youngest audiences, 3.5 million children every week are seeing Newsround in their classrooms. 80% of secondary school children have used Bitesize. And so we've got some really incredible reach amongst those young audiences. I think 12-year-olds trust their parents and the BBC more than anything else. So that's a good place to start. We need to go further in producing content that speaks to their lives and shows up where they are. And I'm delighted that we're working with YouTube and other platforms to increase the content that we make for those audiences that goes where they are. But we've got a lot of work to do, and it's our job to rise to that challenge. How will you protect the BBC's independence, and how will you rebuild public trust? I think this is something, last year the BBC did a big survey of around 900,000 people, and the number one thing, 90% of people wanted to know that the BBC's independence from government was assured. And part of the charter discussion is to ensure that that's the case. The government's talk about moving to a permanent charter, which means that instead of every 10 years, we don't know whether the BBC will continue to exist. The assumption is that it will, and Parliament would have to make an active decision to stop it. That's quite an important shift. Then there's board appointments and governance, which is something the government is looking at again. And finally, there's having enough funding to fulfil our charter. One of the reasons we're having to make cost savings is that over the last 10 years, we've lost about £1.3 billion worth of public funding. And the majority of that has been because governments have chosen to freeze the licence fee when costs are going up. So we need to make sure we've got sufficient funding as well as governance in place to support the independence of the BBC. The other part of the question was about trust and how do we regain trust? And I think I'd rather say the question is how do you earn trust in everything you do every time an audience member comes to the BBC? And I think that's something which we have to think hard about. We take nothing for granted. Despite some of the issues that we've had, the BBC is still the most trusted news organisation and media organisation in the UK and around the world. But I think we need to earn that trust and re-earn that trust every time you come to us. Here's a question. How are you going to protect the BBC and what sort of cuts to programmes are planned? Obviously that's really on my mind. If you're not familiar with this, before I arrived, the BBC announced that we needed to make about £500 million worth of savings because of how the funding model has shifted and the fact that we need to continue to fulfil the charter with less resources. So that's really tough. And with colleagues, we've been looking at how can we achieve savings while focusing on the most important priorities we have. So we try to apply some principles around protecting the content that's most valuable to audiences, around trying to find ways to reduce duplication, streamline and make the BBC more agile, and to sustain the majority of spending in things that matter most to audiences. So we're having to look really hard at all of the ways in which we support programmes, the array of different roles we have in the BBC to reinvent ourselves, to fulfil our mission with less. But of course, the other part of that is making the case for a well-funded BBC that can do everything you want it to do into a very, very competitive world where people have got infinite choice in the palm of their hands, and we have to win trust and win audiences in everything that we do. Why is Winterwatch being cancelled when it's more important than ever that people support nature due to climate change? This is something that we've announced as we try to make sure that we follow audiences and we're showing up where they are. So actually what we're doing is shifting to Nature Watch all around the year, and we'll have a series of programmes that are available on demand that can help people see what's happening all through the year. So we're always having to make changes to our schedules. Sometimes we have to do them in response to cost constraints as well, but we also need to keep innovating and serving audiences as our behaviours change. So I hope that people will enjoy that new iteration of our Nature Watch series and join in with that show. This is a long question. The BBC plays a unique role in local journalism. At a time when commercial local newsrooms are shrinking and misinformation is spreading online, how will you protect and strengthen BBC local radio and local news services over the next decade? Well, this is something really close to my heart. About 25 years ago, I was working in local journalism, and I noticed that, since that time, about 300 local news titles have closed, and about 2/3 of the journalists that used to be there are no longer jobs that are active across the UK. So there's been a huge shift in local journalism, mostly driven by changing consumer behaviour towards online and a change in how the advertising market works. What the BBC's done, I think, is pretty impressive. I went to visit the Local Democracy Reporting Service, which is an organisation based out of Birmingham that works with local news organisations. And since they were established, over 500,000 stories have been published in over 1,000 local news publications across the UK. Something like 160 jobs have been created through those partnerships, and that's one of the ways in which we're looking at ensuring that local journalism continues to thrive, not just at the BBC, but in partnership with the industry, and I think there's more to do there. This is the last question. To increase funding for the BBC, why don't you cap senior management and major staff salaries and only increase senior pay by rate of inflation each year? Well, it's a tough last question, but it's a good question because I think people are always concerned to make sure the BBC's value for money. So where are we at the moment? We're actually in the middle of, we've got a pay review underway. And to give you an example, what we're doing there is the top team is getting no pay increase, and we are making the biggest increases to the most junior staff. So I think it's an important part of what we're doing in tough times when there are resource constraints and funding constraints on us. There's also always a question, I think, about how much we pay for on-air talent and for senior managers. And I've never seen so much transparency as I've found at the BBC in terms of publishing all of the pay of those people. What I can say as I looked at it, those who are paid the biggest bucks, the number of those have fallen by 50% in the last 6 or 7 years. The total pay bill for that cadre of people has fallen by about £20 million or so. And we've always got this tension, I think, between value for the licence fee payer and making sure we've got the best talent working for the future. What I've found as I've talked to thousands of people since joining the BBC is that people are here because of the mission. They want to come here to fulfill that mission brilliantly, working in one of the world's most creative journalistic organisations. And so they will come here for less money than they might be able to make elsewhere, but it also needs to be an environment that allows them to do their best work, and that's what we need to get right. Thank you for all those amazing questions. That is the end, but I'm happy to take more. One of the best things about my job is hearing from audiences and learning from their questions how we can be a better BBC. Thank you.